All right, guys, so this is going to be your Tuesday social studies lesson. It is lesson three because yesterday you had a pretty long introductory lesson, so I'm going to make this as short as possible for you today. So, lesson three, we're going to be able to describe what slavery was like in the South and explain what the Underground Railroad was. So, your activity is going to be filling this in, and it's going to be coming from your PowerPoint slides, okay? So, one way that slaves attempted to escape from freedom to escape One way that slaves attempted to escape from their plantations to freedom was through a system called the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was not an actual railroad, and we've talked about this before, especially when we were on our field trip. It was just a secret pathway that slaves would follow, getting them out of the slave states and into the free land. People who led the slaves along the route were called the conductors. Hideouts and homes were called the stations. Slaves would follow the North Star to guide them. The Underground Railroad ran from about 1810 to 1860. It's estimated that over 100,000 slaves escaped to freedom during that time. So, what were the stations like? Slaves would stay in secret rooms underneath stairs or in barns on the Underground Railroad. So, these are some examples of places that they would hide, okay? Slaves would have to travel at night in hopes to not get caught. They would wait at one station until the next station was ready for them. And then one of the most famous conductors is Harriet Tubman, and we've spoken about her before. Conductors or leaders of the Underground Railroad were people from various backgrounds. Some were people who were once slaves themselves, while others were free white people who believed that slavery was wrong. Both the slaves and the conductors risked their lives to be a part of the Underground Railroad. One of the most famous conductors was Harriet Tubman. She was born into slavery in Maryland around 1820. At age 28, she escaped to Philadelphia, traveling on the Underground Railroad. Although she gained her freedom, she returned to the South again and again to help other slaves. During the Civil War, she served as a nurse and continued to fight to end slavery, and she died in 1913. So I have some fact cards here that I've uploaded to your Google Slides here. I just wanted to go over them just because it's a really good document for you to look at to get some extra facts about what's going on right now. So, not only could slaves be punished for getting caught, but so could those helping the slaves. It was against the law to help slaves escape. Pennsylvania was the first state to abolish slavery in 1780. Canada was often referred to as the promised land by states. Remember, Canada is not part of the United States, it's a completely separate country. So, a lot of people refer to it as the promised land because slavery wasn't a thing in the country of Canada. Um, Many slaves escaped all the way to Canada in order to be safe from being captured again, because a lot, especially as we get into Reconstruction, you'll find that slave traders would go in and kidnap African Americans from the North who were free and bring them back to the South as runaway slaves, even though they were not runaways. One famous conductor of the Underground Railroad was named Levi Coffin. He was a white man who helped about 3,000 slaves escape. Slaves traveling on the Underground Railroad were often called passengers or cargo, just like something or someone on a real railroad train would be called. Slave owners wanted to arrest Harriet Tubman. They offered a reward of $40,000 to anyone who captured her. Some slaves escaped further south into Mexico or Florida instead of going north. Most conductors and helpers on the Underground Railroad were free blacks or former slaves. Most stations were not actually located in the South. Slaves had to get themselves to a free state before they could receive any help in hiding. The term Underground Railroad was not actually used until 1840. Even then, it was most likely used by Northerners and not the slaves themselves. Many Quakers, a religious group, were involved in helping the slaves escape. There was no one route that slaves would travel on to freedom. Instead, there were many, many different paths that a slave would travel on to get freedom. One person who hosted a station called John Rankin would hang a lantern in his window to indicate that it was safe to travel to his home. Slaves would travel mostly at night to keep from being seen and be caught. Many people in the North did not actually support the Underground Railroad. In fact, even those that were against slavery did not support breaking the law in order to help a slave. Although over 100,000 slaves escaped using the Underground Railroad, it was still a small portion of the total slaves. There were over 4 million slaves in the late 1800s. Harriet Tubman returned back to the South 19 times to help slaves escape. Most of all, the traveling on the Underground Railroad was done by foot. Some parts of the journey were over treacherous land and mountains. The Underground Railroad was most active during the years before the Civil War. Frederick Douglass, a former slave, became famous for his leadership in the Underground Railroad in New York. Slaves would often hide in cupboards or under floorboards to remain safe at each station. Harriet Tubman herself escaped to freedom using the Underground Railroad in the late 1840s before helping others. Sometimes conductors would pretend to be slaves so that they could sneak onto plantations to guide slaves on the Underground Railroad. So, these are all some really important facts to know and understand as we talk about this. So, make sure that you go back to your actual activity and complete it and make sure you share it with me.